welcome to another episode of Interlink, a podcast by the Center for New Economic Studies at OP Jindal Global University. At Interlink, we aim to break down intellectual barriers and approach key issues from diverse policy and research perspectives through deep conversations on the evolving social, political, and economic landscape. In this episode, we turn our focus to the lived realities of marginalized urban communities and the ways in which their voices are represented or too often left out in both policymaking and academic discourse. Our conversation will explore questions around participatory research, urban vulnerability, and the intersection of identity, labor, and place in fast changing cities. We are delighted to be joined today by Professor Namesh Kilan Shetty, a transdisciplinary researcher whose research centers on urban governance, community rights, and the lived experiences of dwellers and artisan communities. Professor's work highlights the importance of participatory methods that place communities at the heart of research and policy making. Professor Namesh, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Shivali. I'm so glad to be here.
To get started, we'll have a general question about acquaintance and your work. So, on that line, your work does focus on experiences and struggles of urban communities, particularly vulnerable ones. And what is it about this field that drew you to this line of research? And what particular answers were you hoping to answer? What particular questions were you hoping to answer?
So to answer this question, I think I've always used this bit whenever I have to introduce myself in the first class of every course that I've taught. And after some time, actually, a student kind of told me that my story kind of gave him the vibes of Mohan Bhargav from Swadesh. And I realized that's where I can draw the parallels as well. Um, before my work in public policy, I had a life as a civil engineer for quite a few years, where I worked for major corporates that included the Mumbai Metro. This was way back in the early 2010s. And as a part of my work as an urban planner for the Mumbai Metro project, it also involved identifying stations where the metro had to be built. And as a part of that, I had to identify certain locations which often had slums, and my work at that point of time was to even identify the slums that needed to get evicted. That was kind of a turning point for me where I felt that what I had done through my studies and all through my education was not fitting well for the society as such. And that was a turning point. I really felt that maybe there's something a lot more than working for a corporate and doing something that actually jeopardizes the lives of thousands of vulnerable communities as such. So immediately after that, I started working for a nonprofit. Did a lot of activism, but you realize activism unfortunately does not really pay you that well as wish you would want to. So research was the next best thing that I found, and that really kind of took me in a way that I found really settled in this phase. So since then, a lot of my research, in fact, all of it has been primarily with a hope to understand how we can create platforms for certain groups of the society for their voices to be heard, and more importantly, understanding from a policy perspective as well, in terms of how do we kind of make sense of the policy making, which is completely the opposite of the existing top-down structure as such, right? So the focus around here is to kind of make sense of the challenges as well as the solutions that come in from these communities itself, and designing policies that reflect their needs as compared to what is thought by a bureaucrat or a policymaker at the capital of the country.
That's a very insightful answer. And jumping off of this with your experience of working for corporates and also being an activist, what have you seen and what do you think bureaucrats or other people who are involved with urban policy, what do they miss or tend to misunderstand or in fact just ignore about how vulnerable communities adapt and resist to marginalization when faced with it?
In my personal experience, I think one of the biggest challenges or problems that I see is for policymakers and government officials to not actually identify slum dwellers, homeless people, or marginalized communities as an equivalent stakeholder in the urban building process as such, right? I mean, most of the time you have slum dwellers who live in lands that are often owned by the government itself, or it is owned by the railways or private bodies. And you, as you might know, like in any urban setting, land is the most valuable asset. So when land supersedes people in terms of the importance that can one have. So automatically people who live in such areas do not get the precedent importance as such. And also at the same time, our policy making has been very uh, traditional as such, where we still, in many cases, slum dwellers are still considered to be a transient population. So the policymakers think that, oh, they've come, they'll stay here for a few months and they'll go back to wherever they've come from, which is not the case. I mean, slum dwellers or anyone who come, people who migrate from other locations are here for to kind of mobilize their position in the society and basically have better sources of income from which they can kind of have from which they can have a better life. And in this process itself is exactly how the city goes, right? I mean, the city grows as such. You have more and more people coming in. They kind of come together as a community. They integrate all the aspects of how a city functions and grows. But unfortunately, what happens is when most of the policy making, the process, the way in it's structured, we often do not, the policymakers or the governments often do not consider them really as important as such. So, in fact, a lot of my current research that I'm working on has been on understanding evictions as a phenomenon, where it's heartbreaking, but at the same time fascinating to see the kind of rhetorics that are used by politicians or even by government officials to justify evictions that include and I'm talking about in official policy documents where slum dwellers are identified as criminals, as deviants, as even pollutants, as it was the case with the Uttam Nagar, the Uttam Nagar's potters in Delhi. I mean, so when such kind of rhetorics are used against certain communities, it becomes easy as such to justify the need for any kind of large scale action, such as evictions. And that is the reason where these policies completely ignore the process in which the communities grow, the communities function in the city, and at the same time, how do they use their social capital and resources to build the city as one.
I think that's a very relevant point you brought up about the evictions. Could you expand more on how these rhetorics and these narratives find their way into into like mainstream ways of thinking about seeing slum dwellers as criminals or as pollutants?
I think a lot of this actually begins from the very definition of what a slum is. The connotation or the actual word, the meaning of the word slum comes from 18th century Victorian English, where slums were identified as those locations in London where criminals and petty thugs used to live. And as the British came to India and they started expanding their domain here, they found it common as such to identify similar locations which were dirty, which they felt that people of their kind did not live to be identified as slums, and that what got stuck over time. And since then, the moment we see that, okay, there is a particular location of the city that does not have the same kind of resources or have people that do not look like the rest of the citizen, the sort of city as such, you immediately identify them as outsiders, right? And as the city kind of grows, I mean, as I've been saying before, land is always considered as the most valuable asset. Often the city creates, larger cities often create master plans where they plan for where they start thinking of what all could be the part of the city for the next 20 or 30 years as such. And often that land is earmarked for future use. And it's the same with the railways as well. I mean, railways is the country's largest like landowner, and as the railways has to expand, they often purchase land in large amounts so to earmark it for future use. And often it's exactly those areas itself that communities live. And when the time comes, or even before the time comes for that matter, you realize that it's very easy. I won't say very easy, but the policy, the people in power do not have to really struggle a lot in terms of deciding that, okay, if we see that there's a massive community that have come here, it's much more profitable for the city as such to build, say, a shopping mall, or like lease it out to a private developer to create a massive a condominium unit instead of leaving it as it is. And that is where this phenomenon starts, right? Where you start evicting people, often forcibly, without giving any notice. In many cases, you also have these large-scale sporting events that happen. So a lot of my research has been trying to understand this how the phenomenon of this large-scale events. I mean, in India, you had this recent G20 event, the G20 that had happened in Delhi a couple of years ago, where almost all the slums that were from the airport to all the major government locations in the center of the city were evicted. The same thing happened during the Commonwealth Games, which was one of the largest, like large-scale evictions that had happened in Delhi. Something as even when Donald Trump had visited India in 2021 in Ahmedabad, the same thing happened. The parallels are all over. It's not even in India as well. The same thing happened in Rio de Janeiro during the Olympics that happened there, in South Africa as well. Even some places as what you consider in the global north, as in Paris, and in Stockholm as well. Whenever you've had massive events, you see people who are homeless, who are vulnerable, who are chucked out of the city just because it does not give a presentable image to the city as such.
Point about these people being considered outsiders, or you even mentioned they're not considered equivalent stakeholders. Can you expand on this and also connect it to how you use participatory approaches in your work? So how does this look in practice when you're working with communities that are spoken for rather than listened
Sure.
to?
So this is kind of an interesting aspect because all this time I've been talking about how slums, or the people who live in slums, are seen as outsiders, and yet, as you might have observed while traveling or in Delhi or any major city as well, slums do flourish and are existing in large pockets all across the country, right, in all the major cities. And a major part of it is the political aspiration or the political factors behind it, where slums are traditionally considered to be as large vote banks, right? So you have politicians coming in and promising that, okay, we'll develop this area if you vote for me. And then once the person comes, everyone with a hope that something better might happen, would vote for a particular person. The elections happen, the person vanishes, and then the same cycle gets repeated every few years. So there is a reason why slums persist in cities. And at that point of time, at the same time, I mean, policies have been there in the country for the last 50 years. Most of these policies, while they were very, I would say, aggressive, I mean, that kind of aggressive policies existed. Even they exist even now to a larger extent. But when I say aggressive policies, it means evicting them and relocating them to a public housing unit, which are often located in the outskirts of the city. But now, in the last few years, a lot of progressive policies have also come in, which basically also include providing property rights or ownership rights to the slum dwellers in the land where they live in, or providing access to the different kinds of infrastructure like water, sanitation, street lights, and so on, in the slums in the areas where they're living in. So now, as my work as a participatory researcher, what I tend to do is basically understand the challenges that are existing in slums at a grassroots level. So it's easy. I mean, when you look at literature or like research or even common narratives of how slums are, I mean, the first thing, as I've been saying again and again, land comes as the most important aspect, right? But is it the case that every slum dweller living in every pocket across the country considers land as the important resource? Or is it that something, or it could be possible that in a given setting, having access to education for their kids might be more important than anything else? Or even in most cases in my research, I found that access to sources of livelihood is more important than owning a house in a given location. So as a part of my participatory work, my research has been all about understanding this diversity in the nature of challenges that slum dwellers have, and also, and at the same time, based on this understanding, kind of making a sense of the different preferences or of the different needs that slums might have based on the context or the location that they are in. Um, and kind of from that, using multiple methods that include qualitative and quantitative approaches, I try to make sense of what could be the best way of understanding that in a given slum, this is the most pressing need. And from that, in what ways we can make this a knowledge transfer to the people in power, to the policymakers, who can then take efficient action. While this seems straightforward, while we write papers about it, while we do research, unfortunately, the reality is far from the same. But as of now, what I have been trying to do is, and a lot of work as participatory research is all about empowering the communities to be a part of this process, right? So as of now, as I was saying, policy making is very top down in nature, where slum dwellers have no right or no say to basically say that, oh, this is the most important thing for us, and why don't you do this? Whereas someone in the capital of a state would say that, no, okay, we've got money for this, and this is the only thing that we're going to do. Um, excuse me. In a participatory research, what exactly happens is you're kind of understanding what is happening from their perspective and how the solutions can come in through their understanding as well. So this is where you're kind of bringing in the bottom up approach as a response to the top down policy making that exists. And somewhere down the line, the research, what we try to do is kind of come to a common ground between the top down approach and the bottom up, where the results are more pragmatic and can be more implementable as such.
So you've talked about how, as a researcher, you've been trying to implement a bottom-up approach. But while doing this, and especially in academic and in policy spaces, how do you take the care to ensure that the experiences of slum dwellers are represented with authenticity? What kind of steps do you
Mhm.
take to make sure that it is their experience that you're sharing?
There are a few things that we have to take care as a researcher whenever you're interacting with vulnerable communities as such, where one of the most important aspects when you're dealing with marginalized communities is the importance of building trust and relationship, right? I mean, so when I'm working with slum communities, it is not possible for me to just take a cab and go to a slum in North Delhi and like ask a bunch of questions and again come back to my home. So you would want to have to spend a lot of time with the community to build that mutual trust and understanding before initiating any kind of formal research. I mean, all of my fieldwork that I've done, on an average, I've had to spend anywhere between 15 days to 2 months just kind of interacting informally with the community before and kind of explaining them the purpose of my research before starting the kind of work. And at the same time, after doing that, the second important aspect I would say is the importance of using participatory approaches, right? So when I say participatory approaches, that means that you cannot just rely on surveys that have a fixed questionnaire with a fixed set of responses. Instead, you use approaches that are very open-ended, that have very open-ended questions that include interviews, focus groups, even visual mapping workshops. So that is something that I use a lot in my research, that allows the community members to actively shape the research processes and outcomes. And in all of this, what you're doing is you're prioritizing the first-hand narratives and the stories itself. So the stories take the center stage, then the purpose of what you want to do. So because so that they are not overshadowed by all the academic jargon in terms of what is it that you want to do, or even from an institutional framework as such. And what ties all of this as such in a central process is having the transparency of what you're doing this. So when I go to a slum and do research, I cannot give them false promises that, oh, if you become a part of my research, I'll make sure that your slum is developed within a year, or you'll get the access of the things you want to, because those are not aspects that are in my control, or I'm not in a position of power to make those changes. So it's very important to be transparent, to make them understand the purpose of why you're there, and making sure that they understand the research goals, how the inputs that they provide are going to be used, and taking their consent at every stage. I think these small steps have a lot of importance in terms of how do you engage with the community, how do you build that rapport, and consequently conduct the research the way you want to.
Points about building trust and also making the community a part of the process is extremely interesting. And this I would also like to hear more of like first-hand experience. I think you've recently written about the Kumhar community of
Sure.
Uttamnagar. So
Yeah.
that community, and can you tell us more about the ethnographic fieldwork that you did for that project, and also what did that teach you about how communities use cultural labor even in a rapidly urbanizing world?
Sure. So the work at Kumbhar community at Uttam Nagar was a very interesting research that we did. A lot of it was also for the part that because I was not the central researcher there. What I meant by that is we used something what is called as a feminist ethnography approach, where the idea was that the researcher, like the identity of the researcher, also makes a lot of difference in terms of how the respondents would connect with you and what kind of and what kind of information you'd collect. So we had two young women going there who talked with the women also and men living in Puttam Nagar, trying to understand their aspirations, trying to understand their stories in terms of how Uttam Nagar started, how it is kind of going on, and the challenges that they face. And at the same time, kind of making sense of the differences of how these responses varied between men and women. So a lot of that was around this focus. With respect to the nature of work that we had done there, Uttam Nagar was a great example to understand how a community saw coming to an urban space as a way or as a solution for their survival in a given space of time because of the lack of opportunities that they had in the areas that they came from. And over time, how the same process of urbanization now posed a threat to their cultural labor, to the cultural labor and survival, right? I mean, we extensively talked about how this constant threats of pollution that they got because of using their traditional wood-fired kilns had led to legal action and scrutiny from authorities like the National Green Tribunal. So a lot of our work was basically to kind of build these narratives where they would kind of talk about how their traditional use of wood-fire kilns actually did not constitute major sources of pollution when you compare them to like stubble burning or the pollution that comes out of like your automobiles or factories for that matter. And at the same time, what we also wanted to show in that research was how market forces in an urbanized environment it was transforming that cultural labor, right? Because gone with those days where the potters could just survive with kind of creating the pots or creating the products based on their cultural background and based on what they liked. But as of now, because of the availability of cheap machine-made alternatives and the preference for fancier products, even the potters had to attempt to modernize their work with new designs and cater to the seasonal like demands as such. So often this kind of becomes interesting because you realize how a traditional craft is becoming is increasingly becoming a commercial endeavor driven primarily by consumer preferences than actually by cultural practices as such. And that was something we really wanted to focus on there. And it was just interesting to kind of look at how the struggles of the community while being so vocal about where they believed as being important to the part of the city and even their identity as potters. They talked about how there were people who had actually traveled abroad, had represented the country across exhibitions, but at the same time, their own struggle in the city has just been riddled with challenges.
So to relate to you've talked about the feminist ethnographic process and also you've spoke about your research with eviction. So just as two kind of final questions, the first being what kind of directions and communities are you focusing on in your current and future research? And
Okay.
secondly, you spoke about the bottom-up approach, but what other changes, both at the policy level, at the research level, even at the social level, would you hope to
Hmm.
see in how Indian cities treat their most vulnerable residents?
Sure. So I'm currently working on two primary research projects. I just completed a couple of research projects a few months ago, and now I'm in that phase of starting a couple of new ones. So one of them has been a part of this understanding evictions as phenomenon. While this is not a new project, this is something that I've been working on for the past few years. But now we've been kind of trying to systematically understand how evictions as a phenomenon is still constituted across cities in the global south, and at the same time realizing that in certain cases, evictions might be the only option that an urban local body might have to undertake. Say, for example, there is a slum that is located right next to the Bhalswa landfill in Delhi. So in that case, if a slum has to be evicted, I mean, you know that it is a health hazard for people living there. And in that case, the community needs to be evicted. So what we've been trying to research is understand a certain sense of direction in terms of in what ways you can have a more humane way of evictions, or if I should not use the word evictions, a more humane way of relocating slum communities in certain incidences, taking successful case studies from cities all over the world. So we've been trying to build this massive taxonomy of different kind of reported incidents that have happened. At the same, so this is more relying on secondary literature. But at the same time, I'm also doing some primary work. I just started a new project which focuses on slums in Srinagar city, where we've been trying to understand how the outdated definitions of how a slum is kind of defined kind of may have a lot of impact on the communities in themselves. So we realized that in the city of Srinagar, most of the localities that are a part of the old city, while they might not be traditionally called as a slum, but they are identified as one because of certain outdated definitions that the urban local body uses, and because of that identity, how it becomes challenging for them as such as citizens in this given spaces to even access the resources as such, and kind of make them threatened. So as of now, we are doing some background work, and in fact, next month itself, the plan is to kind of go to Srinagar, spend a few months there, talk with the residents who live in those areas, and try to understand the impact of those definitions, and if the areas that are termed as slums in the database, in the official records, are actually what you constitute as slums. But other than that, I mean, I just finished a research project last year, which was we did some field work in the slums in Gurgaon. And it was a fascinating context where in the two slums that we studied, the residents were primarily from West Bengal, Muslims who were from West Bengal, but this was an interesting intersectionality of the study was an interesting intersectionality of religion, of identity, and class as well. So because of them being because and our response and our study primarily focused on women, where we realized that their identity as a Muslim woman who could speak Bengali was often misconstrued as a Rohingya Muslim from Bangladesh. And that led to their extreme discrimination in the areas that they were working to, even to the extent of the areas where they were, like even the areas where they lived. So a lot of our work in that paper was primarily to understand the daily challenges that they faced, and how their misconstrued identity kind of posed a lot more difficulties in their life than what it should already, like how in the, as compared to how difficult their life already is. And the other part of what you said in terms of this idea of how do you make this bottom-up research more accessible? Unfortunately, as I don't know if you might have realized already, when you talk of bottom-up research, it's a very time-taking process, right? And because I'm talking about you want to go to community and try to understand what is happening. And for someone who's working with the government, who is a policymaker, obviously they do not have the time of actually going at a slum to slum basis and understanding the resources there. So what I have been trying to do in my research is kind of try, as I was saying before as well, is trying to come to this middle ground where you can actually kind of take use of some of the top-down policies that are coming from the state and kind of use that to identify some of the responses that may be applicable with respect to the solutions that might have come from a bottom-up perspective. So over here, institutions like NGOs and local activists have a lot of importance there. So my work, while as an academic and a researcher, unfortunately, I might have very limited access to be an activist because of the location that I'm there and the other responsibilities that I might have. But my work, what I've been trying to do is give an informed understanding to local NGOs and civic organizations that are working with those communities so that they have a better idea to kind of make sense of the challenges that the communities face and become a mediator between themselves and the government.
Thank you so much for that answer. That brings us to an end of today's discussion. We sincerely appreciate the insights you've shared on the challenges and the issues face that marginalized communities are facing, and more particularly about how we can make a better place for them by representing their voices with care in both research and policy making. It's honestly been incredibly enlightening to hear about your work, especially the participatory research and your reflections on your own fieldwork. So, I mean, from Interlink, just a final thank you for joining us and for offering such thoughtful perspectives on these critical issues.
No, thank you so much, Shivali, for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about my work. And as academicians, I think you might realize that people tend to love speaking about their own research because it often gives them a platform to talk about the kind of kick-ass work, what they believe as kick-ass, and hopefully they start thinking that everyone else thinks the same as well.